Welcome to The Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky, a weekly podcast that breaks down politics, policy, and current affairs. I'm Becky Scherr.
And I'm Michael Brodkorb.
We are excited to be here this week after some breaking news over the weekend that President Joe Biden is bowing out of the race for president. We are joined today by two of our favorite panelists. Coming in hot with the most breakdown appearances, let's welcome John Rouleau. John is the executive director of Minnesota Jobs Coalition, has long been active in Republican politics and campaigning. And back for his second visit to the show, we have Mark Drake. Mark worked for Senator Coleman and Governor Pawlenty and has held senior communications and research positions in support of presidential, statewide, and local political candidates. Mark and John both were on just a few weeks ago as we analyzed the following the first presidential debate. Today, we are going to break down Biden's announcement to drop out and the initial reactions to hearing the news. We will then discuss what is next when it comes to the DNC convention and subsequent nomination of Kamala Harris and the battle surrounding the Biden campaign millions. We will break down what this means to the state of the race between Trump and Kamala Harris, and we will get into Harris's VP choice and the local angle. Thanks for joining us and enjoy the show. So over the weekend, Michael and I were texting, how much more can Biden endure? / if he hasn't caved yet, what will actually break the dam? It's officially happened. He's out. Want to get initial reactions and from each of you. And did you actually think it was going to happen? Mark, I'll start with you. Did you think that Biden was going to get out? And what did you think when we heard the news on Sunday?
I vacillated on it toward the end. I thought maybe he'd get out, maybe he'd stay in. His staffers, his campaign team, they had been on the Sunday shows that morning reiterating that he's staying in. So I didn't know quite what to think. And when it came, the announcement, I had to read it a couple times to make sure it wasn't some disinformation or some deep fake, but it was real. I think he did the only thing that made sense. I think he was doomed had he stayed at the top of the ticket. So from his perspective, his family's perspective, his team's perspective, I think he did the only thing he could do.
John, what's your thought?
I think we were all on this podcast a couple of weeks ago and said that we didn't think that he was going anywhere, that he would dig in. Uh, and I think it really just shows how untenable the situation had gotten for the Democrats. I was speaking with a couple of people, and there seems to be this sense that if he isn't up, that he removed himself from the race because of medical reasons, because of his age. And really, what I think it comes down to is that he removed himself from this race because he couldn't win. I think it remains to be seen whether he could have made it through this campaign with his age. But what became very clear is that he was not going to win. He was not going to be successful. And just as you stare that down, I was talking to some Democratic friends of mine, and the feeling of relief that they had when he made the decision to get out of this race. And just thinking about how terrible of a question that must have been, where they look at Kamala Harris and think, oh God, what a relief we get to have Kamala Harris at the top of our ticket, and somehow feel better about where things are going. So it had gotten really bad for them over the last couple of weeks. And I think surprising, and then probably was the best decision that he could have made for the Democrats' political future.
Michael, I think you and I messaged, and it was always almost every day the last week. It's happening today. It's not. It's happening today. It's not. So what was when it came to it, do you have any shock, or you thought you were on it's happening today?
I was surprised. I mean, we had a podcast a few weeks ago, and I was in a good group. I was with three people that were smarter than me, and we all agreed that it was going to be tough for him to do it. But then, I was part of, been talking with some of you, texting off air, and it became clear that I think his position became much more tenable, and some of the efforts that were done to shore up his base continued to not work. There was a slow drip over the last few days where it started to get more. I think that his COVID diagnosis was, I think, an issue, but I was surprised when it happened, even though I expected it. We were getting closer. And as Mark said, I think I was going back and forth as to whether it would happen. I was just, surprised when it actually happened because it's so historic. We're in such uncharted territory. Surprising, and be interesting to be a part of the discussion today. But at the end there, I was surprised. It makes sense now. I mean, I look back at our discussion. I think we had a very informed discussion, but I think what we couldn't predict is what was going to happen in the following days and weeks. And the situation never got better for him. And so ultimately, I think it was the right decision to make, as John described, because he can't win. I think it was the right decision for the Democrats to make. I think the same kind of institutional questions I had still exist. We'll see where this discussion goes, but I'm surprised. And that's where we're at. Becky, your take.
Yeah, I really got to the point. We've been almost, what, 2 weeks since the debate happened, 2 weeks of pressure, wild top Democratic leaders coming out and opposing him, his continued candidacy. It just seemed to me that if none of that broke that dam, I wasn't sure that dam was going to break. I thought they seemed so steadfast and so cohesive, and the strong letters and messaging coming out of the camp, the family, and the like. I really had gotten convinced that it just wasn't going to happen and he was going to force move forward. So was definitely shocked. But I think then we also want to, I'm interested in the takes on the actual announcement. We got a letter without the official seal, which I guess I don't know if they can technically do that because it is a campaign, not an official thing. But Mark, you mentioned trying to figure out if this was real or not. It was just a letter. We got no video, no primetime sit down interview breaking the news. White House staff found out on social media as well, which I understand leaks happen. That's probably how it has to go. But John, you've worked on a lot of campaigns, probably done some breaking news of sorts. Was it surprising to you that we didn't get a some sort of Biden to camera, whether through a recorded scripted video or a friendly interview? Or is it potentially just how bad things are for him right now with COVID and the general competency?
Yeah, I'm always hesitant to read too much into this. What we know is that Joe Biden, yeah, I think that this was a hard decision for him to make, that this was really something that, from all reports, really was eating at him, and he was thinking over very carefully with a couple of close advisors and then family members. The thing that surprised me was that with his most senior staff, they had a video conference at 1:45 Eastern, and he clicked send on the tweet at, what was it, 1:46. Yeah, that is how little time even his most senior advisors had. So given how close they kept this to the vest, I'm not surprised that it didn't go out in some sort of a pre-recorded video or some sort of announcement that you need to rely on a wider circle to really get. It doesn't take much to write up a letter, scan it back in, load in a tweet. So if you're really hanging on to the last second, don't want it to leak out, and want to be the one who breaks your own news about your political future, I think it makes sense from that standpoint. The things that have surprised me since then are that the White House chief of staff is the one who is calling cabinet secretaries and telling them that Biden is not going to run for reelection. And it is that we haven't seen anything really since this letter went out, that there was no follow up, that there was no plan for yesterday evening, certainly today. Nothing this week. We got another letter from the president's doctor saying that he's on Plaxavid, that he's recovering well from COVID, but we still haven't seen him. There's nothing on his official or unofficial schedules. And that's really surprising to me, is that I understand the keeping it close and putting out that letter initially, but now what? And I think everyone's waiting, and I don't know if he's waiting because he doesn't want to step on Vice President Harris's news. She certainly, I think, has some momentum as she's rallying the troops, getting everybody within the Democratic Party really on board for the most part, and then raised $250 million yesterday. That's no small thing. It's possible that he's being a team player, but yeah, I don't know that I fully buy into the idea that Biden is over there being a team player and that he's not stewing in Rehoboth and, yeah, just mad and mad at the world.
Mark, you've worked in communications, advised campaigns. Do you think that it's odd that we haven't seen visually anything from Biden making this announcement? And do you think that's, I think, a one way of looking at it, that it is strategic? Or should we just get it over with? Have him do the video and then we can officially move on and it's officially Harris?
Yeah, it's definitely a little odd that an announcement of that magnitude would not be accompanied by a photo or a video. And I know they say he's had COVID since Wednesday. I'm not disputing that, but that's how many days into it by that point? 4 days. It's certainly unusual for an announcement of that magnitude to just come out on Twitter like that. I just he and his family, they just may no longer care about that sort of thing, right? It's just such a wrenching decision for him personally that maybe that they don't care. They just wanted to get it over with, and that was the easiest way for him to deal with it. And they just made that decision with a small circle of advisors and letting Kamala take over center stage now.
Michael.
I wanted to say at the onset, stewing in Rehoboth is now potentially going to be a fantasy football name or potentially a garage band name because that was a great reference. I'm going to take credit for it right now. That's a great line, John. So a couple things. I knew it was real because Mark Drake sent it to me, and he has no history of ever sending me a false flag or any misinformation. He's very good about that. I knew it was serious, knew it was true. I was also catching up on Veep, which was just fitting. And yes, I want to separate two things here for a second. I want to separate the candidate Trump versus candidate Biden versus President Biden. My concern, and I didn't jump on this right away, but the debate performance was shocking to a lot of people and all of us too. We had a discussion on it. I think the questions I have right now is not about candidate Biden getting in this mix. It's what's going on with the president right now. Where is he and how is he doing and what's going on? I think that I the format of the letter, how it was presented, the fact that we're hearing information about his symptoms and relatively mild, I it does raise some concerns. I do think it would be good if he were to come on and give some type of statement and speak. I know he's going to do that in the coming days, but I think by now I think it's reasonable to ask some questions because there has been such a concern about what's been going on when the cameras aren't around and the functions of the office. I think it would be normal for him for I think there's a number of concerns I think that we're all looking at, but my concern is separate from the campaign. As Mark pointed out, this is a gut-wrenching decision. I wouldn't expect him to embrace and be a part of the campaign, but he does have a job to do as president of the United States. I know he's not feeling with dealing with COVID. I will say that I have been paying much more attention to his physical presence when he's been on TV. And I thought the video of him coming back after he had been diagnosed with COVID was probably the slowest I've seen him. And so I think the questions and concerns about how he's doing and what's going on are valid. And I think it'd be good for him to come out and give some statement. I'm not joining in on the calls that he has to do it by 5 p.m. tonight to show some proof of life. But I do think it would be good for him to relay some concerns about how he's doing and reassure the country that the chief executive that's occupying the office of the presidency right now is in the position to lead and continue to run the office.
I completely agree. I think it's super valid. My mom texted me on Sunday saying, do are Republicans sending around talking points? Because I heard Mike Johnson say this, and I heard Tom Emmer say if he's not fit to be candidate, he's not fit for office. And like you, Michael, I'm not saying we need some proof of life, but I feel like Americans do deserve to have a little confidence in the leader of our country, to that he is alive and well and that he is able to function for the next 5 months here and protect all of us and our homeland. And that's something that I think he should do. And I think he should do sooner than later. And I think as the hours go on and that doesn't happen, I think it is more and more concerning why he can't just, he doesn't have much on his calendar. Why can't we get a 5 minute scripted video of him just to sit there and say, hey guys, I'm healthy, not feeling the greatest, chat with you next week. I just feel like there should be something more there. And Republicans are going to continue to hit home on this. And I think Republicans, they have dueling things now. Now Biden as president is what they're going to hit on. And also obviously having some new angles going towards this whole situation, the chaos on the Democratic side. And I want to open-ended question. And if anybody just wants to jump in, if you have an answer to this or have any thoughts on it. But I saw a meme over the weekend of would Democrats, quote unquote, let Republicans switch the nominee this late in the process if they were not polling well? Meaning, is this something, if the roles were reversed, it's a little sketchy, right? We're all in agreement that it's largely because of the polls and that he's going to lose to Trump if Biden stays on the ticket, in addition to obviously all sorts of other things. But if the roles were reversed, would the press and the Democrats not be having an absolute field day of them circumventing this process that's set up to elect the nominees? Anyone? John?
What a win for bringing back smoke-filled rooms. We've got a world where essentially looks like the Democrats have gotten their way on this. But I do think that there's some risk involved here for the Democrats, right? The reason that they got themselves into this mess is because they essentially set this process up where the primary was a coronation for Joe Biden to become the nominee again. They shielded him from primary opponents, they shielded him from having to campaign, they shielded him from having to do any of that work, even as people like Dean Phillips and Marianne Williamson were out there trying to give people a choice. The DNC shifted up the schedule, they canceled debates, they really put their thumb on the scale to coronate Joe Biden. And now we're seeing the coronation of Kamala Harris being picked by the party insiders, the party elites saying, this is going to be the nominee that replaces you. And that's a real risk in that if you look back to 2019 and the early days of that presidential campaign, Kamala Harris was not a particularly strong candidate. She was awkward, she was weird on the campaign trail, she didn't click. Yeah, I think when she's in prosecutor mode, she's at her best. But when she is in candidate mode and she's trying to be deep, I almost wonder if the writers of Veep were time travelers and went back in time to base Selena Meyer on her. But just the things that she says and the way that she speaks, really, it's like a caricature of what kind of a really bad politician would do. So I think that there's some risk involved there was they clear the field for her, much like they did for Joe Biden. And maybe we would have figured out more than 4 months from the election that Joe Biden had some serious liabilities heading into a general election if they had allowed him to be tested. And I don't know that the Democrats have really thought about what happens when they find out that Kamala Harris had some real vulnerabilities that maybe would have been exposed in a short sprint primary. This kind of coronation, I think, just to be very clear, they haven't had a convention yet. There hasn't been a nomination. They are well within their rights to nominate whomever they would like for any reason. Joe Biden can release his delegates. There's nothing that prevents them from putting her name on the ballot heading into November. But I think the question is whether they should be doing it the way that they're doing it. And I think that there's just a lot of risk involved in that strategy.
So let's get into this a little bit because first of all, I got to make a pitch. If it's been mentioned twice here, if you haven't watched Veep, you need to go watch Veep because you're right. Selena Meyer is Kamala Harris. But so we're effectively as recording this episode with the understanding that Kamala is going to be the pick. We'll come back and do a special episode if that somehow becomes not the case. But I'm interested to see. I always love infighting, seeing that amongst the Democrats. I'm interested to see as they come if we see some people being really vocally and publicly upset about this essentially just being handed over to Kamala. But so far, most of the speculated candidates or other potential candidates that have been speculated have endorsed. We've got Whitmer, Newsom, Buttigieg, Shapiro, Kelly, Bashir. I mean, they're all come out, thrown their weight behind Harris. It's really just person after person has done so. They correct me if I'm wrong. I haven't seen any big name people not or point them elsewhere. There are a couple that we're still waiting on as time of recording this. I don't believe Obama's come out, and some others that folks are certainly waiting on. Here in Minnesota, so far we've had Chair Martin, Governor Walz, Ellison, Klobuchar, Smith, McCollum, Omar, Craig have all endorsed Harris. Dean Phillips would like a straw poll, maybe some sort of debate at the convention. I love him for being Phillips, wanting the conversation and going down that road. I doubt we'll get that. But hey, more power to him for being the leader and saying the quiet thing out loud. So I want to chat a little bit now about, John, you alluded to some of the Kamala problems. I've seen a bunch of articles already pointing to the prosecutor versus the felon and kind of setting it up on that. But to your point, there are a lot of vulnerabilities about Kamala. And obviously, we can all probably right now point to a half dozen or more word salad, completely flubbed speeches and public appearances she has. And she's got immigration and this whole debacle that is immigration that she's been propped up as the czar, the leader of. Michael, I want to get your initial take of Kamala as the candidate and what you think with the Democrats running and pushing her now forward, aside from some of the reasons financially why that might be the case.
One of the things I think is very interesting about it's going to be Kamala Harris, and I want to give a shout out to my sister-in-law who mentioned this on Saturday when I was with her down in Iowa, and she said, "Wouldn't it be a smart move if needed that Biden stepped back and gave her an opportunity to lead in the office. And I think that's something that's I still think is an absolute possibility. And I want to set the table on that. I think John and we've all articulated, and John was going through the scenario of what the Democrats did to make this possible and how they bypassed the process. And that's a card that I think is still an option to them. That I think that the Democrats have done the hardest part now, which is they took the car keys away from the from Biden. And now the question is, do they do more? And I think it's pretty clear, at least from my perspective. I think the Democrats would be willing to do anything they need to do at this point to try to prevent Donald Trump from winning the office of the presidency. And I think if there is a perceived benefit to giving Harris the keys to the White House early, I think the Democrats will do that. But I think there are a number of challenges that she will have independent of that. I think there's some challenges that, as John articulated, she was not doing well when she ran for president in 2000, got out. And so I think that they have rushed this process a bit. I agree with Congressman Phillips, and bless his heart for going out there and suggesting ideas. But to John's point, and to Becky, as you framed up the question, I do think that she's going to have some vulnerabilities and a truncated process of getting her the nomination, which is now moving at lightning speed, I think is going to deny the opportunity for Democrats, the press, and others to kick the tires a little bit respectfully, as we do on candidates in this process. And I think there's going to be a number of potential vulnerabilities that come out. I don't want to answer for Mark, but I'd like Mark to possibly, if he can, give a discussion of what he's told me over the couple weeks, what he expects the next couple weeks to be for Harris, because I think his insight of some of the discussions we had is likely where I think this could go.
Yeah, to Michael's point, I think Kamala Harris definitely has a number of vulnerabilities that the Trump campaign is going to seize on and hammer her on. And first and foremost would be the border and then inflation. But Kamala Harris is never someone she's never had to really appeal to swing voters. Obviously, she was Biden's running mate, but she was not at the top of the ticket. California is a very liberal state. So she's never had to temper her tone or her votes or her comments, really. And I don't know how well she's going to play in Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. I was doing some looking at the Electoral college map yesterday
Nerd.
when Biden made his announcement. And I think Trump is probably at 262 electoral votes pretty much in the bank, because you look at you consider all the states he won in 2020, and then I think he probably wins Arizona and Georgia, and that takes him to 262 right there when you add all the states from 2020 with those two states. So he only needs a Pennsylvania, Michigan, or Wisconsin, and it's over. So he just needs one of those three, and it's over if he does that. So I think it's tough for her. I think the Democrats probably went from a 20% chance of winning to maybe 35, but it's tough. And Kamala is not, I don't know how much appeal she's going to have in those three states at the top of the ticket.
Mark, one of the discussions we've had is about, and where I was going with my lead in there was, you have in some of our offline discussions, you've said what the next couple weeks are going to be like in terms of the media framing of Kamala Harris. Can you talk about that for a second? Kind of your kind of expectation and what you think?
Yeah, I think the media, the national media Kamala's going to have a halo on her head. And this is going to be the greatest thing since sliced bread, this campaign, it'll allow her to reintroduce herself to the public. I think I'm not sure how well that's going to work, but I do think obviously the Democrats and their friends in the national media will do everything to make sure she has a successful reintroduction to the public. And I think some of that's going to be Kamala's really a moderate because she was a prosecutor, that sort of thing.
I think that's an interesting way of looking at things because she certainly does need to be reintroduced. While she does have above all of most of the other, according to polls, of most of the other contenders, she does have the highest name ID, so she has that going for her. But she still is not universally known like a Biden or a Trump, and so there's certainly going to be a lot of work that needs to be done on that. And you're right, she's the savior. She came in and she's rescuing the Democratic Party, and so I think it is going to be interesting and probably cringeworthy to watch the parade and watch the fanfare fawning over her. But we'll stomach it and analyze it and have all sorts of conversations where we probably will make some jokes about it. So I can't wait for that side of things. Moving forward, we chatted a little bit from it. John, you just got back from the RNC convention. DNC convention is in August. Articles are saying that the Rules Committee is going to meet this week. They need to call, potentially, are going to still call a virtual roll call vote, yet to be determined what that actually looks like, all hinging on the Ohio ballot eligibility, which is a deadline of August 7th, which is before their convention because this was planned so well. So, technically, from my understanding of things, like Michael mentioned, I believe Biden can release his candidates, but until that is officially, I don't know what the official way about doing that. There is no real mechanism from defectors at this point. I assume if that endorsement does not do that, then he'll tweet or do whatever he needs to do. But any idea what this looks like in terms of DNC? This is obviously historic. We've never seen this before. Any idea of what they need to do, rules or the like, to be able to transition from Biden, who all these delegates are bound to?
Yeah, I think looking at this, yeah, there's still some kind of uncertainty about whether or not Ohio's August 7th deadline is really in place. The legislature did move that back, but it is moved back effective September 1st. So I think that there's some Democratic strategists and people sitting over there saying, ooh, do we really think that Ohio is going to stand by this legislative change that they made? So I think that the Democrats are probably going to operate from a assumption of safe versus sorry and still try and get it in under that August 7th deadline. The thing that will be interesting to see is how many of these states come through and unanimously decide to throw their support to Harris. Know that I've seen a lot of big states where their delegates have already had a virtual roll call within their state announcing that they are unanimously backing the vice president. So this thing very well could be sewn up by the end of the week with nobody else really getting into the mix and the delegates being essentially released and rebound because they're deciding to bind themselves to the Harris campaign. So, yeah, I think it's going to be a short sprint, but if I had to guess, this thing's pretty wrapped up by the time that we hit August 1st.
Mark or Michael, any other insight or takes on DNC rules?
Yeah, I would argue to John's point that I think Kamala's already got it sewn up. I don't see the upside for anyone to challenge her. Really, at this point, she has all the institutional support. Obama's really the only sort of major figure that hasn't endorsed her yet. What would be the upside to take her on right now? If you have ambitions to run in 2028, if she loses, hey, you were a team player, you were there fighting the good fight with the rest of the team. So there's no real upside to take her on at this point. I would say that I was looking at the real clear politics direction of the country, and I know the Democrats are on a bit of a sugar high here with the relieved Biden's off the ticket, obviously. But the right track number average right now is 23%, wrong track 67. So I think everyone's losing sight of that a little bit in the sugar high here with Kamala's entrance into the race. So I'll just throw that out there.
And the
Um,
people who don't seem to be losing track of that are those 2028 contenders who everybody was rumoring and saying might run this year. If you've got your eyes on 2028, if it seems like Kamala is the preferred outcome here, you talk about why do you throw yourself into this? That's doubly so when you look at the fact that even as Mark was just saying, what the Democrats have maybe a 35% chance to win the White House, that they have a really steep hill to climb. Yeah, burning your political capital and your chances at 2028 to be the guy who loses to Kamala as she goes on to lose to Donald Trump is really not a appealing thing, I think, for a lot of those people. So yeah, there's a lot there. And like I was saying, like, yeah, looking at Kamala Harris's approval rating, what her approval rating is sub 40. She's minus 15 to minus 20 on the image, depending on which surveys you're looking at. Yeah, that just gets to how bad were Joe Biden's chances where this is the better choice for the Democrats.
This reminds me of the movie Argo when he says, "This is the best bad option that we have." To me, that's like, this is the best bad option that we have about what they decide to do. One thing two things I'm watching out about the convention. Number one, I think that I'm interested is if the opening up of the process, getting a new nominee getting a new running mate for Harris, if that does anything potentially on the platform, if there's any type of concessions that need to be made, one of the issues that Becky we've discussed is uncommitted concerns about what's going on in the Middle East, Israel, Hamas, what's going on in Gaza, Palestine, that entire part of the country. Uncommitted was a big block. There was already some rumblings, I think significant rumblings that the convention in Chicago could be contentious, could be some fights and contentious. And so I'm very curious to see if any platform issues get reintroduced or if there's any of that type of thing. But I will say to you, I was down in Iowa at a family reunion for a family wedding reception when I was down there. And I used this analogy down there when I was talking about this. And I said, when the news broke, I said, what may happen now with Biden stepping back, and that is going to change the focus of the convention, where I think at least one night or so it's going to be all focused on Biden and a cheering, and he's throwing himself at save democracy and all that type of stuff. That may change the ability for people to want to mess around at the convention. It's like there was a family fight right before your parents' 50th wedding anniversary celebration. Like you'd go to them and say, look, you'd go to your siblings and say, nobody make a stink. It's mom and dad's event tonight. Nobody make a stink here at nobody fight at dinner tonight. Let's all be on our best behavior. Let's do it for mom and dad. And so I'm wondering if using that kind of family kind of event, if the fact that the entire election map, the strategy has been thrown out. If there is a possibility, because of how it is now, if that's less likely of that there's going to be some disruptions, or I think it's more likely. I think, and I'll be as bipartisan as I can with this, Republicans and Democrats have an element of their parties where just people love to make trouble on any given situation. So I wonder though if what's happened here in the last 24 to 48 hours, if that changes the likelihood of there being disruptions on any policy issues at the convention, whether Biden stepping away changes the tone or anything. That's something I am watching for about introduction on platform issues, particularly related to the Middle East and other things.
So we spoke about it a few weeks ago how the delegates at the national convention are largely Biden's folks anyways, right? The campaigns kind of work within the parties to get their folks elected to be their delegates at the national convention. So that's no real shock. But Michael, I'm going to throw it back to you first. When we talk about the money side of things, as of the last report, Biden had some $91 million cash on hand sitting in the bank. And from Democrat interpretations of it and some legal interpretations and potentially the FEC's interpretations, because that money is filed under Biden and Harris, they're saying that essentially that money can be now Harris, right? The Biden for president has already filed their
Correct.
paperwork to change it to Harris for president. Do we think, I'm going to pose the hypothetical, if that was not the case, if that money could be transitioned to whoever was the next pick candidate, do you think it still would have been Harris?
The money helps. I think the fact that they can transfer it to her, I think helps their argument. I'll leave it up to others on the call to answer is if Biden and Harris had both stepped back and it was going to another entity, I don't think that money could have been transferred. I will also say to you, this isn't for a discussion today. It's something to watch, I think, is potential legal challenges. I don't know if there's going to be a legal challenge on that. I think that the Democrats are playing a confidence game a bit about that by changing the name. I think I've heard some rumblings about potential lawsuits and stuff. I think it's something to watch. I think that the fact that it was Harris already on the committee, I think that she just slid into that spot. And I think that tidied up a problem. But if they didn't have Harris, I think there would have been a real issue with that money and what they could have done with it because it's a sizable amount of money. And to John's point about how much they've raised, having that legal entity that it can go to is certainly an appealing part of the cleanup process in this. It made it much easier in my perspective.
John, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think we discussed that there were a couple of things that you could have done with the bulk of the money in that account, whether it's transfers to party committees, transfers to a 527 type group, transfers to another kind of outside group. This certainly makes it easier. Candidate dollars and those kind of hard dollar, $3,300 increments are always the hardest to raise. So, yeah, I think it's a benefit there. But by all reports, Biden's campaign had started to raise a lot less money. He was down under $25 million over the course of the last month. This has been a really hard month for them. And I think regardless of who came out of this thing and regardless of who came forward to be the party's new standard bearer and their nominee, I think there was just always going to be that shot in the arm of just a jolt, right? Where Harris raised what $100 million in small dollar contributions yesterday, raised another 150 for the super PAC yesterday,
Oof.
might have a $500 million week. That's nuts to think about. That would this is has obviously energized the Democrats, I think, in a way where we've talked about those double haters. We've talked about the fact that roughly half of the Democratic Party thought that Joe Biden was too old and lacked the mental capacity to be the president, to be the candidate and nominee. So I think that there were some real concerns on the Democratic side about what his staying in the race meant. And just because he was their guy and they were riding with Biden didn't mean they were excited to ride with Biden. So I think there's definitely some enthusiasm, and this is something that the country has been, telling pollsters and telling us that they have been hungry for quite a long time, which is they didn't want Donald Trump or Joe Biden, and they've gotten their way where they're not going to see that. And this is the first election in a long time, right? What? It's the first election since 1974 that won't have a Bush, Clinton, or Biden on the ballot, which is really remarkable to think about. We're talking about it's been 50 years where there has been a Bush, a Clinton, or a Biden on the ticket in every presidential race. A brave new future where we're staking that out, where we can move beyond those three families. Uh, but I think, like I said, there was a lot of pent up energy, excitement, and small dollars sitting on the sideline ready to go for whoever it was.
I like your shout out, I believe, to Chair Martin's statement, riding with Biden till Biden's not riding. Great little drop there. Mark, because I also love to pit people against each other. Do you agree with Michael that you don't know if you'll see any financial or any challenges to the financial transfer here?
You may see them. I think the Democrats were probably pretty confident that they're going to succeed there.
All right. I really think that they're going to push hard. I think Republicans are going to push hard on this because we love a good court case. So that's my expectation here. I'm going to go into now the state of the race. Trump v. Actually, I'm going to take that back. I'm going to say Trump v. Harris. This is one thing that I'm going to defend Miss Vice President on. Often, a big pet peeve of mine is when a female candidate's in the race, we call them by their first name, we call the men by their last name. We're going to go but with Harris and not be referring to her as Kamala here. John, you stole my thunder. I was that stat of the 50 years since no Clinton, Bush, or Biden on the ticket, I think is just absolutely fascinating. Another fascinating historical context that I have here is that Harris would be the first Democratic nominee from the West in the entire history of the party. So far, the furthest west was Democrats were George McGovern from South Dakota in 1972 and William Jennings Bryan from Nebraska in 1895, 1900, 1908. Michael, your skeptical look, is that not correct?
No, I'm just running the numbers. I'm going through my head. I can pull. I'm pulling. It's right. It surprises me because I'm like, wait a second. No, you're spot on,
I
Mark.
just absolutely shocking and not something I ever thought about.
Mark, I can think of candidates that ran from the West, but not ever the nominee. Mark, can you think of any?
No, I think Becky's right there. It's
Well,
Yeah, I
first of
didn't
all,
get it
to
for the
believe.
I read it in an article.
no one does better show prep than Becky. And I'm just, it's just when she said, I'm like, wow, but it's right. It's just, I'm trying to run it in my head. That's amazing. So we have not, so Kamala Harris will be the first Democratic nominee from the West. And you're defining the West as,
This is
um,
South Dakota and Nebraska are as furthest west as it goes.
wow, that's a great figure. That's a great stat.
Thanks. I thought so too. Looking at the polls, and you guys have very well articulated the fact that it is going to be a hard road to victory for any Democratic candidate. Some recent polls in some of the key states have Trump up 6 in Pennsylvania. This is Trump v. Harris in the polls, obviously then hypothetical from early July 10th to the 12th. Trump's up 6 in Pennsylvania, up 2 in Michigan, 1 in Wisconsin, and 8 in Arizona. We are just slightly over 100 days until the election. There's a lot of work to do. And obviously, with it being Harris versus some others, we're understanding that the transfer is a little easier with staff and campaign infrastructure and finances and all of that. And we've spoken to this a little bit, but Mark, I'm going to start with you. Curious about talk to us a little bit about the enthusiasm gap that potentially now is getting closed without having Biden on the ticket. We have seen that Harris polls better than Biden with women and with minorities and some of those undecideds in the middle. What does this look like aside from the electoral college numbers, but just based on looking at support in polls?
Yeah, so I do think you're going to see a surge of enthusiasm here out of the gate for Paris in terms of fundraising, enthusiasm. I think Democrats were obviously desperate to get Biden off the ticket. The question is, in 100 some days, is that enthusiasm still going to be there? How is Kamala Harris going to handle herself as a candidate? As John and Michael mentioned at the outset, when she did run on her own in 2019, she didn't even make it to the Iowa caucuses. Her campaign was such a disaster. And again, she's never had to appeal to a broad based electorate. She's run in California, run successfully, but it's a very different electorate, I would say, in Wisconsin than it would be in California in terms of the ideological makeup of the voters. So she's got her work cut out for her. I think my guess is she's not going to wear well over the long term, just given what I know of her and the campaign she ran in 2019 was not successful. I do think she's far left. I think people have pretty much made up their minds on Trump over the last 8, 9 years. The question is, how is Kamala going to do with working white men in Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin? I think that's the question of the election. Who's going to win? If someone wins those three states, they're the president. I think that's pretty clear. But if Trump just wins one of them, he's the president.
John, we talked, or a tweet that I saw that just today was Franklin's tweet that talked about Kamala Harris's path to victory. And it will really hinge on three quick key questions. Can she name any successes as VP? Can she relate to swing state voters? And can she win over those anti Trump voters, but who were not the double haters who didn't want to vote for Biden? What's your
I'll start with the last one on the double haters. And I think that as we look at those, there's two distinct buckets of the double haters. So for by and large, those double haters are people who did not like Donald Trump in 2016. They didn't like Donald Trump in 2020. Maybe they voted for Evan McMullen or Gary Johnson or did a write in, wrote in Romney or Rubio or whatever it might be in 16. In 2020, they were exhausted. They were beaten down. Maybe they voted for Joe Biden. There's a couple of different baskets of them. One is the basket of people who are a double hater and have come to regret their vote for Joe Biden because these are not, for the most part, these are not liberal voters. These are center left, center. They probably were not aligned with Joe Biden, but they wanted some normalcy and they were promised that we would get back to normal. They didn't get it. So there's a policy sect of these double haters. On the flip side, there were some very Joe Biden specific double haters who thought that he was too old, that he lacked the mental capabilities to be the president, and were throwing their hands up and saying, really, these are my two choices. And so I think those voters who thought that Joe Biden was too old, those are in play for Joe Biden to, or for the vice president to go try and get. The policy ones, she has all of the failings of the Biden administration and then some, right? She ran very far left in 2019. Let's not forget that she ran on the platform of banning plastic straws. She ran on the platform of banning fracking, of banning private health insurance. She has advocated for a wealth tax. Yeah, if you don't like the policies that Joe Biden pushed, you're going to hate the policies that Vice President Harris wants to push. So I think that there's still a lot going on there. Specifically with regard to fracking, right? That's a huge one in Pennsylvania. And Pennsylvania, I think, is my tipping point state that I'm watching. And I don't see a path for a Democratic candidate to win without winning Pennsylvania. We talked about Georgia arguably looking like it is going back to being a red state. Arizona certainly looking that way. North Carolina certainly looking that way. Pennsylvania really is that last piece, and I think it's the most likely to flip of the blue wall of Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin. But they need to win all three of those states in order to get across the finish line. I'm watching there. As far as whether or not she can connect or not, I think she does have some strengths that Joe Biden doesn't have. She's going to be able to cobble together, have an easier time pulling together a traditionally Democratic coalition in order to get across the finish line, I think. There's early indications that women are more enthusiastic. That's one of those areas. Non college educated white women are one of those areas that Joe Biden was really struggling with this time. And then college educated white men, is another bucket where Joe Biden did well in 2020, but was really struggling this time. So I think looking at how she connects there, there's certainly room to grow. But all of this is in the context of uh, if you look at the dates and the scheduling, there are 4 weeks between the last day of the DNC and when early voting in Minnesota starts. She has a 4 week run from the time that she is the actual nominee until voting starts. So that could be good for her. It's fewer opportunities for her to talk about being unburdened by what has been undone, but it also is a really short opportunity to introduce yourself and get out from underneath Biden's shadow. He also was out talking, and they said, "What would you say to Vladimir Putin about invading Ukraine?" She said, "Don't, right? Don't." And what would you say to the people coming across the border? Don't come. And there are absolutely failures that she will have to own from the Biden administration and some real vulnerabilities on her own agenda and her own platform as well. Yeah, I think Republicans are excited to have that conversation. Yeah, I think the people who are most disappointed are the people who have to redecorate the Trump campaign's office down in Palm Beach because the wall, as you walk in, said Joe Biden is failed, weak, and dishonest. Now they need to come up with some new art as you walk into their hallway and head into the office.
One question before we move on to the next subject is, if this had been made prior to the Republican National Convention, do you think Trump would have changed the calculus in how Trump made his pick for VP, and i- would this have changed the dynamic? I think it would have, possibly, but I want to let others answer first.
I will say no. I think the Vance pick looks pretty obvious in retrospect. I think Trump wants someone who can be that heir apparent for him when he's no longer president, if he's president again. So I don't think he would have said, "Oh, I should have picked Nikki Haley because she'd run better in the suburbs." I just don't think so.
Yeah, full agreement there. That was a very confident pick and a legacy pick. Uh, I do think that Trump world did see this coming, though, right? He took active strides to try and not mention Joe Biden in his speech on Thursday night. Every critique, and people said, oh, he was very focused on Joe Biden. And if you actually go listen to the speech, he was very focused on the administration. And all of his critiques were the administration has failed on the border, the administration has failed on inflation. He very much was hedging his bets on the fact that it would be Vice President Harris.
I liked Becky.
Yeah, I don't know because I didn't actually think it was gonna be Vance until it was, so maybe I haven't thought much about it. I think it's an interesting question, though.
I think it's always smart to have some balance. And so I would like to believe that they would have made a different decision, but it's clear based on the wisdom of others, that's probably not the case. I think it may have been a little bit of a different decision, but we are where we are and we can move on. But I think it's going to be very curious to see the appeal. I think a subject, Becky, we've spoken a lot about is engaging female voters. And so I'll be very curious how that's a number I'm going to be watching on enthusiasm. Not to say that all women vote in the block, but just their engagement and how Republicans are going to be able to tap into that. But that's going to be something to watch on my end.
Dovetailing off our VP conversation, let's chat potential Harris VP pick. Maybe in the asked and answered question, Governor Walz, anybody? Any takers? High on the list? Michael, thoughts?
I don't think it's going to be Walls, but I absolutely think his name should be in the mix. We can go back. Becky, this would be a perfect opportunity for you to remind our listeners something, which is
Since you endorse Governor Walz for governor, would you endorse him as VP?
think his name should absolutely be in the mix. I've tried to offer fair analysis on this podcast, Becky, contrary to your desire to want to pit people against each other, which you disclosed for the first time on what you love to do. I think Walls will be in the mix. I think I'll leave it to others to articulate the reasons why they think not, but I think his name is in the mix. And in fact, we did a segment of an episode discussing why he should be considered in the mix. I ultimately don't think it will be him, but I think it's completely reasonable to have his name in the mix. But I'll leave it for others to debate the pros and cons right now.
John, you spent a lot of time articulating Walz's shortcomings. Do you think he should be on the short list here for Veep?
Generic white governor from Nebraska, I don't think brings a whole lot to the mix if you're the vice president looking to expand the appeal. He also has governed from the far left. So while he may have had a reputation as somewhat of a centrist while he was in Congress, he has abandoned that and run and embraced all of the policies and agenda of the squad, running to the far left and appeasing the socialists in Minneapolis on his in his base. So I think, yeah, there's really not a lot of upside there. I think somebody like a Josh Shapiro would make a lot of sense. A dark horse who I think would make a lot of sense would be Jared Polis from Colorado, who could have kind of some cross appeal. Although I've got to read this tweet because his quote was by far my favorite quote of anybody in the Veep stakes. And he said, if they do the polling and it turns out they need a 49-year-old bald engage you from Boulder, Colorado, they've got my number. Hard to not like Governor Polis, but I think he would provide some much needed balance ideologically to that ticket. Uh, but I think Governor Shapiro, Governor Cooper, also would be really interesting. I don't know that I'm sold on Wes Moore or Andy Bashir. I don't know that a nepo baby from Kentucky really gets you much, but
Wow.
that's up to others to decide.
I want to get more into some of these potential picks. I got to say, I had that quote in my show prep as well. I saw it and laughed out loud. I think it's great. Mark, I want to, before we move on to chatting about other potentials, any thoughts on the walls?
I think it'd be hard for Walls to be the VP pick. I don't think he would bring much to the ticket. And then there's the fact that Eric Holder is the guy doing the vetting, and Walls once voted to hold him in criminal contempt over Fast and Furious when he was a member of Congress. That might be a little awkward for Eric Holder, but stranger things have happened. I doubt it.
Some of the names, in addition, John, you rattled off a few and just have a list here of some of the recurring names I was seeing. Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg, Pennsylvania Governor Shapiro, California Governor Newsom, Kentucky Governor Bashir, Illinois Governor, North Carolina Governor, Arizona Senator Mark Kelly, Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer was on the list, and now she's going to be the campaign chair and has said that she's good with being Harris's campaign chair, is not planning to also be in the sweepstakes here, the Veep stakes. But as I listed all of that off, a lot of those are hitting kind of those key states that we were talking about, the Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Michigan states. Michael, what's your take if you were naming a top two, maybe put Governor Walz further down on the list, but if you were naming top two, who is most advantageous? Who do you think would bring the most to the ticket for Harris?
I think Mark Kelly. I think the astronaut's a great pick. Military background, swing state. I've come to realize I've always wanted to be an astronaut because once I heard you got to go with the astronaut. I know that doesn't speak well of John Glenn, God rest his soul, when he ran for president in 1984. I still think he has a debt from that campaign, but I have an affinity for astronauts, and I think Mark Kelly would be a great pick. The other one, I agree with John's analysis about those. I think potentially Cooper of North Carolina, I think would be an interesting pick, but I'm really, if I were to rank them, I don't think Walz is going to be picked. But I really think if I'm ranking them right now, I think Mark Kelly and Roy Cooper are the ones where I think the numbers are going to look at, where I think where people are going to give some attention to. But that's where I think, again, I'm rooting for the astronaut. That's because I always want astronauts to succeed. So I'm rooting for the astronaut.
Mark, any of these play higher than others for you?
Kelly would be an interesting pick. That would be an all West Coast ticket. Reminds me of Clinton Gore in 92, where you have the geographic, they're both from roughly the same area. That would be an interesting pick. I think Josh Shapiro would be a strong pick for her, given his popularity in Pennsylvania. Yeah, don't see Walls. Obviously, Whitmer said she's out of contention today, but Biden was not going to get out of the race. So things can change in politics.
And Newsom
And
is out.
Newsom,
Newsom's
he
out.
brings up 12th Amendment, right?
Yeah. Explain that to our listeners.
So 12th Amendment states that the vice president can't have the same state of residency. The downside is that those states' electors are not in play if you go that route, if I recall correctly, right? That would be a big problem if you're a Democratic candidate and you can't get electors out of California.
54 electoral votes. And so what that means for our listeners, so the fact that Kamala Harris, the vice president, is from California and the governor, Gavin Newsom's from California, they can't be on the same ticket. Thank you for explaining that for our listeners, John.
That's all I got. Anybody have any other takes of the path forward for Kamala Harris, what it means for the Democrats, or are we just excited to watch the chaos unfold and come back in a few weeks after the convention and see how polls are looking?
Yeah, I would just encourage all the listeners and everyone obviously participated in the show to just think about what we've seen in the last, 9 days? Donald Trump was nearly assassinated. Then you had the convention, and then Joe Biden dropped off the ticket. The first time we've seen something like that in 56 years. We've obviously never seen anything like that happen so late in the campaign for the person at the top of the ticket. So it's been a crazy campaign, and who knows? There may be more surprises ahead.
One last question before we shut it down here is I'm curious about polling. And when do you guys think that we can see some credible polling on a head to head? Is there a buffer? Is now the right time to be doing it? When are you guys gauging in your interest or your credibility when a poll you think comes out and when we can lean into it a bit and actually glean some information?
Yeah, I think I would largely take the polls that are coming out right now, the snap polls, with a grain of salt. Really, you like to see them over multiple nights when they're conducted. Everything that we've seen so far, I think, is a one day, gut check response. I wouldn't be surprised if Harris sees a little bit of a surge. Normally, we see a surge post convention bump. So I think this might be the high watermark for both candidates if you were to go out and field a survey late this week. But I think probably Saturday night, Sunday is when you'll start to see some well done surveys beyond kind of the things that PPP puts out to get clicks and try and get attention for themselves. I think they were among the first to have surveys out today across some of these battleground states, but grains of salt because it's PPP.
Mark, any final thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think John's right there regarding the polling piece. It'll be interesting to see how Kamala is looking coming out of their convention when they have a vice president.
I think we have a lot to I think we have a lot to see her first big addresses, hearing what President Biden comes out and says and when. I think most importantly, there is certainly a lot going on. The DNC Rules Committee is going to be meeting this Wednesday. I'm sure we'll start to have a better picture of what that's going to look like and how that process is going to play out. We have this is we're it's a wild campaign season and we have over 100 days left. So there's going to be a lot of stuff for us to continue to chat with. I'm sure we'll be chatting with you guys sooner than later. So thank you so much for your time and your insight. We really appreciate it. And can't believe that this is a real life episodes and seasons of Veep we're living, but who knows what's next. Thanks, guys.
We want to thank you for listening to the Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky. Before we go, show some love for your favorite podcast by leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts or on the platform where you listen. You can also leave a review or give us a shout out on our website or across all social media platforms at BB Breakpod. The Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky will return next week. Thank you for listening.